object in life was to be Diana. That has always been her passion.
And her idea of elegance is phony to the nth degree.
On the 6th of September, 1997, a young man in a dark suit stood at a lectern inside Westminster Abbey and made a promise in front of roughly 2 billion people. Charles Spencer, 9th Earl Spencer, was burying his sister. He spoke about her laughter and her instinct for compassion, and then, looking toward the royal family seated only a few feet away, he vowed that Diana's blood relatives would never let the institution that had worn her down do the same thing to her sons. It was one of the most quoted funeral addresses of the 20th century, and it set the terms for everything Charles Spencer has done in the 29 years since. He gave a eulogy, and then, for the most part, he disappeared. No memoir, no tell-all interview, no licensing of Althorpe, the family estate where he buried Diana on an island in an ornamental lake specifically because it was a place cameras could not easily reach. That long silence is a backdrop against which every fresh headline about him has to be read, and it is why the latest one has traveled so quickly through royal reporting circles. According to a wave of recent reports out of the UK and Australia, Prince Harry and Meghan, Duchess of Sussex, have been developing a documentary tied to the 30th anniversary of Diana's death in 2027, and that project reportedly required something only Charles Spencer could give: access, blessing, or at minimum, cooperation from the Spencer side of the family. Outlets covering the story, including Australia's New Idea, have reported that Spencer shut the idea down, allegedly during a visit to Harry and Meghan's Montecito home that he made while on his honeymoon earlier this year. One insider quoted in that reporting framed Spencer as the last person in Harry's orbit who might still be able to talk sense into him, someone with enough standing and enough blood connection to say no without it reading as institutional interference. It's worth being upfront about what kind of reporting this is. These are stories built on unnamed sources and insider claims, the standard currency of royal tabloid journalism, not confirmed statements from Spencer himself or from Buckingham Palace. Nobody has produced a signed contract or a leaked memo. What we have is a consistent pattern across multiple outlets, all pointing in the same direction, layered on top of a public record about Charles Spencer that is very well documented and helps explain why so many people found the story believable the moment it surfaced. Start with what's actually verifiable. In 1995, Diana sat down with journalist Martin Bashir for the BBC's Panorama program and gave the interview that reshaped how the world saw her marriage, her mental health, and her place inside the monarchy. It was watched by an estimated 23 million people in Britain alone. For years afterward, nobody outside a small circle knew exactly how Bashir had convinced Diana to agree to it. Then, in 2021, a formal inquiry led by Lord Dyson, a retired justice of the UK Supreme Court, found that Bashir had used forged bank statements to gain access to her. Those documents falsely suggested that people close to Diana were being secretly paid to spy on her. The forgeries were shown to Charles Spencer first, and it was Spencer, believing the material was genuine, who arranged the introduction that eventually put Bashir in front of his sister. The BBC's Director General issued Spencer a personal apology once the inquiry's findings were made public. That single fact reframes almost everything else about how Spencer has behaved since. A man who stood in front of 2 billion people and promised to protect his sister later discovered that he had been manipulated into opening the door to the most consequential, most painful interview of her life. Whatever atonement looks like for that kind of mistake, 3 decades of near-total silence and a sealed private archive is a plausible answer. That archive is the second verifiable piece of the story, and it's the part that makes the alleged Netflix pitch so significant if the reporting holds up. Diana's home movies, personal diaries, and family photographs have never been licensed, published, or shown publicly in any meaningful way. Biographers have tried for decades to get access and have consistently come up empty. Every documentary made about Diana since her death, and there have been dozens, has drawn from the same recycled pool of public footage. Press conferences, official portraits, news broadcasts. The material that would make a documentary feel genuinely new, the unguarded Diana rather than the packaged one, sits behind a door that only Charles Spencer controls, and by every account he has never opened it for anyone, at any price, for any reason. Given that track record, a documentary built around the 30th anniversary of her death, fronted in some capacity by her son, would have real incentive to try one more time. If the reporting is accurate that this attempt also failed, it isn't really a surprise to anyone who has followed Spencer's history. It would be the continuation of a pattern that has held for almost 30 years, not a break from it. The timing matters too, and this is where the story connects to a separate, well-documented thread. The state of Harry and Meghan's media business heading into 2026. Their 2022 Netflix documentary, Harry and Meghan, was by most measures a genuine hit, reportedly becoming one of the platform's biggest documentary debuts ever. Everything since has landed with noticeably less impact. Meghan's lifestyle series, With Love, Meghan, premiered in March 2025 and briefly cracked Netflix's global top 10 in its first week, but according to Netflix's own mid-year engagement report, it finished the first half of 2025 ranked 383rd among the platform's titles, with just 5.3 million views, a low number for a renewed original series. Season 2, released that August, fared worse. Netflix's second-half engagement data placed it somewhere in the low 1,100s to low 1,200s, depending on which report you read, meaning it failed to crack even the platform's top 1,000 shows for the period, landing behind older library titles like Downton Abbey and Superstore. Critics were not kind either. Review aggregators put the season in the mid-30s percentage, range from critics, with audience scores running similarly low, and at least one review described the show as so effortfully whimsical that it became almost fascinating to watch fail. A Christmas special released that December also missed the top 1,000. By early 2026, multiple outlets were reporting that Netflix did not plan to renew the series for a third season, though conversations about additional holiday specials reportedly continued. None of that is speculation. It's public engagement data and public criticism, and it paints a picture of a production deal that has cooled considerably since the couple's explosive 2022 debut. There's a smaller, earlier chapter in the same story that's worth including, because it shows the pattern didn't start with a documentary pitch. It started with jewelry. At the royal wedding reception in May 2018, Meghan wore a piece from Diana's aquamarine ring collection, and over the following months, other items once owned by Diana began appearing on her at high-visibility public events. Butterfly earrings, a Cartier watch, gold bracelets. None of this is disputed. It's documented in wedding and event coverage from the time. There is also nothing inherently wrong with a new bride wearing her late mother-in-law's jewelry. Plenty of families do exactly that as an act of remembrance, and there's no public evidence that Meghan intended anything other than a tribute to a woman she never met but whose son she'd married. What's worth noting is simply that it established, well before any documentary was ever discussed, a recurring public association between Meghan and Diana's personal belongings, one that royal commentators had already been tracking for years by the time reports of a Netflix pitch surfaced. Whether that association is read as coincidence, tribute, or strategy tends to depend entirely on who's doing the reading, and that ambiguity is part of why the more recent documentary story landed with as much charge as it did. It also isn't the first time Charles Spencer has said no to somebody with a serious offer on the table. Over the decades, he has reportedly turned down multiple biographers seeking access to Althorpe's private archive, declined to participate in various television specials marking previous anniversaries of Diana's death, and kept the contents of her diaries and home movies out of circulation even as unauthorized biographies, tell-alls from former staff, and dramatized retellings, including a well-known scripted series, have continued to be produced around her without his involvement. In that sense, if the reporting about a rejected Netflix pitch is accurate, it isn't really a departure from how Spencer operates. It's simply the most high-profile version of a decision he has apparently made many times before, this time involving a nephew rather than a stranger with a checkbook. Set inside that context, a Diana anniversary documentary would have been an obvious play, both emotionally and commercially. It's the one subject in Harry and Meghan's entire catalog that has never failed to generate interest, because it isn't really about them. It's about her. If reports about Netflix's enthusiasm for the concept are accurate, that enthusiasm makes business sense. A cooling relationship with a struggling lifestyle brand, paired with the one asset in Harry's life that reliably draws a global audience regardless of how anyone feels about the Sussexes personally. And that's precisely what would make Charles Spencer's alleged refusal land as hard as it reportedly did within royal commentary circles. It isn't simply that a licensing request got turned down. It's that the one person with genuine authority over Diana's most private material, someone with no institutional role to protect and no book or brand riding on his answer, reportedly said no to the person best positioned to have expected a yes. It's worth sitting with why Spencer, specifically, is the person whose refusal would carry this much weight, because the royal family's own position is far more constrained. Prince William has reportedly been uncomfortable for years with how his mother's image has been used commercially, but he is also the heir to the throne, and every public move he makes is read through an institutional lens. If Kensington Palace or Buckingham Palace had been the ones to block a Diana documentary, commentators would have framed it as the establishment protecting itself, the same institution Diana spent her adult life pushing against. That framing would have handed Harry and Meghan's team a sympathetic angle almost automatically. Charles Spencer doesn't carry that baggage. He has no royal office, no coronation to attend, no public image tied to the monarchy's reputation. His only claim to a say in the matter is that he's Diana's brother, the man who buried her, the man who made a promise at her funeral that the entire world watched him make. A refusal from him can't be spun as palace censorship, because there's no palace behind it. That is very likely why several royal commentators, according to the coverage that followed, described the alleged rejection in unusually dramatic terms, with some going so far as to call it one of the most consequential things anyone connected to Diana has done in years, not because it revealed something new, but because of what it kept sealed. None of this settles a more uncomfortable question sitting underneath the whole story, and it deserves honest treatment rather than a tidy conclusion. Harry has a claim to his mother's story that cannot be reduced to a licensing dispute. He was 15 years old when she died in a Paris car crash while being pursued by photographers, and he grew up inside the very institution his uncle warned about from that lectern in 1997. Whatever anyone thinks about how he and Meghan have chosen to tell their story publicly since leaving royal life, the underlying loss is real, and it belongs to him in a way it does not belong to Netflix executives, production companies, or, for that matter, to his uncle. Charles Spencer's decades of guardianship protect something valuable, a version of Diana that has never been packaged for consumption, but that protection comes at a cost too. It means a woman who chose, more than once and at real personal risk, to speak publicly about her own life is now represented almost entirely through the silence of the people who came after her. That tension doesn't resolve neatly, and it shouldn't. Both positions, the uncle's instinct to keep the last unguarded parts of his sister out of anyone's hands, and the son's instinct that no one, however well-intentioned, gets to be the sole gatekeeper what his own mother's memory is worth, are legitimate. They just happen to be in direct conflict, and there's no version of this story where both fully get what they want. What we can say with more confidence is where things stand heading into the back half of 2026. Reports about a wider, cautious openness toward reconciling with Harry have circulated periodically since he and Meghan's move to California, but multiple accounts have suggested that whatever limited warmth exists inside the family extends much further toward Harry individually than it does toward Meghan, with sources repeatedly citing a basic lack of trust, specifically a concern that private family moments could end up as content. Whether or not that specific framing is accurate, it lines up with a documented pattern. Nearly every major beat in this family's public relationship with the media over the past several years, from the 2018 wedding jewelry commentary to the 2022 Netflix series to the reported 2026 pitch for archival access, has followed the same shape. Something private becomes public, and the question of consent and consultation trails behind it rather than preceding it. If the reporting about Charles Spencer's refusal holds up, it represents the first time in that pattern that the person being asked simply had nothing to gain by saying yes and chose not to. There's also the question of what happens to the wider royal picture while all of this plays out. Because Charles Spencer isn't the only family member reportedly uneasy about how Diana's story keeps being repackaged. William, as the future king, occupies an almost impossible position on this subject. He was even younger than Harry when their mother died. He has spent his adult life inside the same institution his uncle warned about at the funeral, and by multiple accounts, he has never been comfortable watching that period of his life turned into streaming content, dramatized dialogue, or marketing material. But William cannot say any of that publicly without it becoming a story about palace hostility toward his brother, which is precisely the outcome the family has spent years trying to avoid. That's part of why Spencer's alleged refusal carries the weight it reportedly does inside royal commentary. It does the one thing William structurally cannot do: draw a hard line around Diana's most private material, without it being read as an attack on Harry or as institutional damage control. Where this goes next is genuinely unclear, and that's worth saying plainly rather than dressing it up as inevitability. Harry and Meghan Production Company continues to develop other projects, even as their formal Netflix deal has reportedly been scaled back to a first-look arrangement rather than the broader overall agreement they signed in 2020. Whether a Diana anniversary documentary gets made without Althorpe's cooperation, built instead from the same recycled archival footage every previous documentary has relied on, or whether the project quietly disappears the way several previous Sussex ventures have, is not something anyone outside a very small circle currently knows for certain. What is documented consistently across nearly 3 decades is that Charles Spencer has one job he assigned himself in front of 2 billion people, and he has never meaningfully deviated from it. If the recent reporting is accurate, 2026 was simply the latest, highest-profile test of that promise, and by every account currently available, he held the line. So here's the question worth sitting with, because there isn't a clean answer to it. Is guarding someone's memory this completely actually a form of honoring them, or does it eventually become a different kind of ownership, one that keeps even people who loved her most locked out? Diana spent part of her life choosing, deliberately and at real cost to herself, to be seen. Whether nearly 30 years of near-total silence protects the truest version of her, or simply replaces one kind of control with another, is not something a licensing decision can settle. Let us know where you land on it. And if this is the kind of story you want to keep following, stick around, because with the 30th anniversary approaching in 2027, this is very unlikely to be the last chapter